should be fine. I will sit at the back. Once everything's running okay already, then I will go back upstairs. So anything you can just text me. If you need to go home earlier or what, just text me. I will bring you. I can come down about you're leaving at 5:30, right? Yes, I can come down around that time. Huh? She leave at 5:45. Yeah, I mean if let's say you need to leave this because I usually leave office late anyway. So if this one overruns everything, I can come down and take over. So no problem.
Here.
Yeah, I do roll it up.
Yeah, I know. Okay. Yeah, okay. Oh, I changed this one so you can just press this to go forward.
So that's forward and that's backward, right?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, a bit easier to actually see the arrow and press it. Yeah. Okay.
How much sip of water? I managed to get through Tuesday's talk without swelling water.
Oh. Yeah.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So, welcome everyone to this talk by our visiting professor, Professor Melissa Macauley. My name is Go Gyat Yen. I'm a member of the History Department in the School of Humanities. I would like to say that I'm especially delighted to be able to stand here and introduce our speaker today, Professor Melissa Macauley. I wrote Professor Macauley kind of like a boat out of blue because we actually don't know each other at all. We as part of the history department learned that she's embarking on a new project, and so that's why we're hoping that she will be able to come here and spend a week here in Singapore. So she spoke of her working ideas on Tuesday, just this past Tuesday, and many of us have benefited from her sharing. So today she'll talk about her prize-winning book. But before I formally introduce Professor Macauley, please allow me to, in some sense, advertise our Distinguished Lectures in Humanities series. So the NTU Distinguished Lectures in the Humanities series brings together some of the most eminent thinkers, writers, intellectuals from around the world to share their insights and perspectives on a wide range of topics. So from literature to philosophy, to art, history, as well as linguistics, these lectures provide a unique opportunity to engage with some of the most important ideas as well as issues of our time. The series emphasizes the critical contribution of the humanities to education, research, and matters of pressing global significance. The speakers will advance our understanding of key questions within the various disciplines of the humanities and across a broad range of related fields. All lectures are free and open to the public and are available where possible in a hybrid format, providing an opportunity for both in-person as well as for virtual attendees to engage with the speakers and their ideas. So for our audience who are joining us virtually via YouTube, for instance, later on at the end of the lecture, you'll see a particular QR code that will be flashed on the screen. You can use the Slido app to post your questions after the lecture. So now let me introduce Professor Melissa Macauley. We are really delighted she accepted our invitation to come here. Professor Melissa Macauley is a professor of history at Northwestern University. She specializes in late imperial and modern Chinese history from 1500 to 1958. Her research focuses on the interrelated history of southeastern China and Southeast Asia, colonialism and imperialism in East and Southeast Asia, and legal culture in Chinese social history. Her recent book that she will speak about today, Distant Shores, Colonial Encounters on China's Maritime Frontier, was published by Princeton University Press in 2021 and was awarded the Bentley Book Prize from the World History Association in 2022. Her first book, Social Power and Legal Culture, Litigation Masters in Late Imperial China, was published by Stanford University Press. She's currently working on a new project, tentatively titled A People's History of the South China Sea. So please join me in welcoming Professor Melissa Macauley. Professor Macauley, the floor is yours.
Got my reading glasses, but well, thank you so much for that generous introduction and to learn a bit, giving me the opportunity to learn a bit about this particular series. I'm really so grateful to the School of Humanities and the Department of History for inviting me here because I've long respected so many scholars who've been associated with NTU, and so it's just a real honor and pleasure to have this opportunity to talk about my current research a bit, which I did on Tuesday, and talk about a bit about my book, my recent book, Distant Shores. So what I'd like to do is just to make a few points, the basic points about that book, and then perhaps focus a little bit on the areas where I've gotten a bit of pushback, to put it politely, on some of the ideas in the book. And then, of course, if you have any questions or comments, I'd love to have a conversation if we may. So I'd like to make 4 interrelated points in the course of this talk. So let me, there's the book. Princeton always wants me to sort of promote that title wherever I go, which I don't usually do. Okay, so I'd like to make 4 interrelated points in this talk, and so I'll just introduce them very briefly at the outset. The first is that the history of Southeast coastal China and much of Southeast Asia has been entangled. You cannot understand the transformations of one region without reference to the other. So their transactions or interactions have been mutually transformative. And you see this, for example, in the area of state formation, in class formation, and in some ways the structural transformation of the economies of places like Siam and Cambodia in particular, in the case of the people I studied, the Chaozhouis. The second point is convergence, not divergence. I agree with many of the points that Ken Pomerantz makes in his very influential and important book, The Great Divergence. But I disagree with his point that China, unlike Europe, collapsed in crisis because they did not have access to colonial sites to ward off ecological crisis. Unlike the region he focused on, the lower Yangtze, the fate of the southeast coast potentially was much different after 1750. Thirdly, and related to point 2, the process of Chinese settlement and investment in Southeast Asia in the 19th and early 20th century was quasi-colonial, but not colonial. I don't like to use that term, and I'll explain it later, but I characterize that quasi-colonial process as territorialism. I'll explain what that means later. And then fourthly, the social and economic history of Chinese native place or dialect groups in Southeast Asia, and in Shanghai and Hong Kong for that matter, was translocal. That is to say, it was collectively experienced in multiple locations across their maritime frontier. And in this book, I focus on the Chaozhouis, or the Daozhou or Teozhou group. And I chose to focus on them because unlike the Fujianese or the Cantonese in particular, who had a longer and more notable history as commercial powerhouses across the Nanyang, the emergence of the Chaozhouis was a uniquely modern phenomenon, reflecting the simultaneous expansion of the opium trade, the formalization of colonial rule in Southeast Asia, the rise of semi-colonialism in treaty port China, and the political decline of China. So Chaozhou was both a local culture and a administrative prefecture in Guangdong province in southeastern China. And in 1858, a small port in the region, Shantou, known then as Swatow, was transformed into one of these treaty ports. But before I elaborate on some of that, I would like to tell you a little story. Liu Xizhi, the man on the left there, departed for the British Strait settlements on a Chinese red-bowed junk sometime in the 1840s. He hailed from Liulong village in Haiyang district, then Haiyang district, now Chaoan, or became Chaoan. And he initially made a living as a sampan operator, a shanban operator, for migrants like Liu from the Chaozhou region of the southeast coast of China, dominated the sampan business of Singapore in those days. And he engaged in the classic middleman role of purchasing goods from indigenous people from his small and flat-bottomed vessel and then selling those goods in town. By the 1850s, he had established his own firm, known in English as Lo Ajit, but in Chinese as Rongfeng Hong, and he specialized in the production and sale of gutta percha. I don't think I need to tell an audience here what this is, but Gutta percha was a type of rubber that was native to Southeast Asia, and it retains its stability and flexibility in salt water. And so therefore it was spectacularly useful as an insulator for the submarine telegraph cables that were laid during the latter half of the 19th century. And by the 1860s, Lo Ajit had emerged as the leading wholesaler of gutta percha in peninsular Malaya, if not all of Southeast Asia. Now, Liu forged a close relationship with Patterson, Simons and Company, who were major British shippers in Singapore and whose own biggest client was the British Telegraph Construction and Maintenance Company, or TCM, which was the paramount manufacturer and installer of cables around the world. And by 1900, TC&M had manufactured and placed 2/3 of the world's cables. That's over 160,000 miles of conductivity across the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans. And Liu Shizhou was an important part of that story. Here you have a small-time sampan operator from Liaolong village who emerged as the major wholesale supplier to a British shipping firm that itself evolved into the main source of insulation for the world's preeminent telecommunications industry company in the 19th century. So he was the right man in the right place at the right time because he founded his company just as submarine cables were being placed first across the English Channel and Irish Sea in the 1850s, and then across the wider oceans from the 1860s to the 1920s. So he retired to his village, a very wealthy man, in the 1870s, and under the management of his very able sons and grandsons, quote, the fortunes of his business rose as if lifted by a cyclonic power. This is a quote from a newspaper obit of one of the sons, but they tended to use that kind of dramatic language. But the sons and grandsons also diversified the family investments. They stayed in gutta percha into the 20th century, but they moved into opium farming, real estate, modern banking, the rice trade, and gum production in Siam. And so the Liu family emerged among the commercial elite of 19th century and early 20th century Singapore. And their early specialization in the gutta percha trade placed the family at the intersection of colonial resource extraction and the European technological revolution. Their business was also integral to the process that telegraphically linked London to almost all of its colonies and naval bases at the height of British imperial expansion. So this was surely one of the more impressive or remarkable success stories in overseas Chinese history. And yet, aside from their wealth and prominence, which obviously made them unique in many ways, many of their personal experiences were commonly shared with the many Chaozhouis who sojourned between China and the colonies, sultanates, and kingdoms of the South China Sea from the mid-18th century to the 1920s. So let's start with the rural area from which he hailed. And I got this off my phone, so it's not the greatest map on earth, but his village was adjacent to the traditional port called Anbu. Yeah, there we go. Except I'm not left-handed, so it says Anbu here, but the port is really this rivering area up in the right-hand corner. And so it's a traditional port, and it was the main customs station for Chaozhou Prefectural City. So it was a major port in pre-20th century China. And so, but it was also a commercial area offering many employment opportunities. So at the time, the villages in the vicinity of Anbu Port served as porters. Villagers in the vicinity of Anbu served as porters who loaded and unloaded goods between ships. And so locally, these hamlets were referred to as villages of the sea because of their long association with coastal and international shipping. And many of these villages in the hinterland of Anbu emerged as major emigrant centers, not only because of their commercial connections and the ease of riverine transport, especially to the ports of embarkation, but also because of their tradition of rural boating. One specialty that many of them carried overseas, as we see in the case of Liu Xizhi and his family and his early sampan operations. But Liaolong was only one of many such villages in the area. Guoyan, who's better known as Quoc Tam, who was the rice king of Saigon in the late 19th, early 20th century, he departed from nearby Longkang village. I can't control that entirely. And another family, the Guos of Guolong village, were again in this nearby area here, up around there, very close to the Liaolong. Up here somewhere. Anyway, you can read it if you're young, if your eyesight's good. But anyway, so all of these immigrant villages are in this kind of area around Anbu, at least in this area. And so the Guos of Guolong, for example, were very politically and economically well-connected people in Chaozhou. They were also very big-name business people in Singapore at the time. So anyway, one point I make in the book is that the old demographically based theories of economic decline in China, or at least coastal China, overemphasized farming and access to land. So in other words, the old argument held that the human population grew faster than available cultivable land, and as a result of increases or imbalances in the human land ratios, poverty ensued. But in fact, port regions like Anbu and elsewhere in China, I would say, offered all sorts of alternative or supplemental forms of employment, as dock workers, fisher folk, boatmen, sailors, prostitutes, peddlers, sugar mill hands, manufacturers of commodities for export, shell harvesting for lime production, which was a multi-million-dollar business in this area by the 19th century, and so on. So, as I'm sure everyone knows here, the thriving economies are not necessarily marked by every family holding their own adequate plot of farmland. And really by the 1720s in some areas of the coastal Chaozhou, especially Chaoyang, if someone here is from Chaoyang, even farm families who predominantly worked on farming really only derived half of their income from farming. The other half of their household income came from other sources, including the ones I've just enumerated. So there's that. And that's one thing that makes this area kind of special, I think, historically speaking. Now, the collective familial lives of Chaozhouese were lived translocally. Translocally in port regions across a vast water world. That is to say, collective family life was lived in more than one location. In the case of the Liu, family members resided in Chaozhou, Hong Kong, Singapore, and to a lesser extent in Bangkok and Manila. And prior to the 20th century, the women usually remained in China to continue to stake the family claim to village land as their menfolk worked overseas. So workers and merchants alike at least tried to maintain these intimate connections with their native place. Now, Liu Jianfa, the man on the right, he's also known as Lao Kiat Huat, also hailed from Liaolong, and he's obviously a kinsman of Liu Xizhi, but he emerged as one of the three most influential Chinese in the British colony of Sarawak. A Gambier plantation owner on the island, he literally served as the creditor to the colonial state there. And like other sojourning elites, especially those who engaged in this sort of plantation-style agriculture, he periodically would return to Chaozhou to recruit rural laborers to the colony to work the plantations and mines. And this is one reason why Chaozhou natives tended to work for other Chaozhouese across their translocal world. It was part of the overseas labor recruitment process. So they obviously preferred to work for fellow villagers, or at least someone who spoke their dialect and who encouraged them to sail away to distant lands. And needless to say, their parents would know where to find their relatives back home if they lost touch with them, ideally. So for this and other reasons, the history of Southeast coastal Chinese at home and abroad cannot be understood merely within the geographical framework of the village, treaty port, nation state, or colony, or within the social framework of the Chinese or the overseas Chinese. In my view, at least, the most appropriate social category of analysis is this dialect group or native place group. So in this case, Chaozhou people, as opposed to other overseas groups like the Fujianese, Cantonese, Hakka, and so on. But people who lived, worked, and invested together as separate entities. And obviously this is mostly a pre-World War II story. The proper geographical framework of analysis, however vague and ever evolving, is within the uncharted borders of that vast maritime sphere across which so many Chaozhou Chinese collectively dwelled. And I refer to that geographical space in the book as Maritime Chaozhou. And then I just redraw the geographical map of Chaozhou from that overcrowded commercial powerhouse in eastern Guangdong outward to the lands to which they migrated or sojourned. So obviously it's mainly Siam or Thailand, southern Malaysia, Borneo, Cambodia, the Mekong Delta region south of Saigon, and also Treaty Port Shanghai back in China itself. So social life was translocal, experienced across multiple sites. Economic life obviously was translocal. Religious life unfolded translocally, as so many scholars actually in Singapore have shown. Class formation occurred translocally, with many Chaozhouese laborers working for Chaozhouese economic elites at home and abroad. Chaozhouese demographical life was translocal. When I first encountered reliable sex ratio data for the Republican period, that's not very good for the Qing, I was astonished to see that many villages and townships were majority female. 32.1% of the villages counted in Chaoyang district, for example, were majority female. And 20% of the villages in the Liu's home district of Haiyang, also known as Chaoan, were majority female. And most of the Chaozhou districts, or Xin, had biologically normal gender ratios, which is to say, there were slightly more males than females. But you just don't see those sort of out-of-whack gender ratios that you see elsewhere in late imperial and republican China, with 20 to 30%, sometimes more males than females. So initially I had hoped that the sojourning experience and the flow of remittances might somehow have mitigated the late imperial tendency toward female infanticide in this region. But eventually, of course, I read through the British colonial records, for example, which are usually quite ample, and was reminded that 3.3% of the Chaozhou group in the Straits were females, and 96.7% were males in the 1880s. And the vast majority of Chaozhou sojourners throughout Southeast Asia were laboring men. So their villages back home can only be studied in their larger translocal context to understand that they were not majority female at all. A significant percentage of the menfolk had simply expanded the social or geographical boundaries of their villages. And the men, a lot of these men were just living elsewhere. So the southeast coastal maritime frontier was not merely defined by the Qing state with its inner and outer realms, as Ronald Poe has so insightfully described in his own work. Frontier making was a social process, and its boundaries shifted with the flow of human movement. So I see the sea as a vital maritime pathway, geographically linking the home village to an ever-expanding frontier of settlement and economic extraction. In his magisterial global history of the 19th century, it was 1,100 pages long, and that was the best thing about the pandemic was that I had nothing else to do but sit and read it at home during the lockdown. But anyway, I did read it. But anyway, in this great work of history, he noted that European frontier making, or colonialism for that matter, transformed what usually had constituted the hinterland of the European city. In his view, with the rise of colonialism, the, quote, opposite extreme of the city by the 18th century no longer was the rural countryside. The opposite extreme of the city, the European city, was the frontier, or, by extension, the colony. And it was in the city, he wrote, quote, that the weapons of subjugation were literally forged. He then describes the familiar processes of European expansion in which the financial centers of London or Paris or New York or Tokyo emerged as colonial metropoles to their expanding peripheries. What I see as the difference in the Chaozhou's frontier-making case is that the city in question was not the modern home port of Shantou or even Anbu or Zhonglin or any of the other ports in the region. It was the overseas port polities of Bangkok, Singapore, Hong Kong, Saigon, and Shanghai. These dynamic metropoles themselves were economically and demographically incorporated into the expanding Chaozhou social frontier. Urban enclaves of modern Chinese development, they simultaneously were embedded in the colonial or semi-colonial expansion of the European nation-state and made secure either by colonial naval power or by the Siamese monarchy. The home port of Shantou was never as important to maritime Chaozhou as was the collective impact of these distant cities. And as the Chaozhou political order disintegrated after 1891, the overseas ports themselves emerged as havens for investment, settlement, and banking. Now, I'm sure many of you know the Chaozhou's had a long overseas history, and I don't really deal with that too much in the book, but I deal with the heyday of Chaozhou expansion. The heyday of the maritime Chaozhou of this maritime Chaozhou arced from the triumphant rise of the Chaozhou's Siamese king of Siam, Taksin, in 1767 to the catastrophic collapse of the global economy in 1929, which was followed almost soon thereafter by World War II and then by the Chinese Civil War. But during this heyday, the Chaozhou's merchants joined the ranks of the Fujianese and Cantonese as commanding players in the commerce and commodity production of Southeast Asia, while legions of laborers sustained their families by sojourning abroad to work. From 1869 to 1948, almost 6 million Chinese departed the treaty port of Shantou. Not all of them were Chaozhou's, obviously, but most of them were. But anyway, employed primarily by Chaozhou Chinese-owned businesses, they produced gambier, pepper, rice, sugar, and fruit on overseas plantations and in mills, or they toiled in mines or served as boatmen and sailors. Capital derived from overseas investments primarily was reinvested abroad, while the home folk grew dependent on financial remittances and philanthropy. And those remittances exacerbated the class disparities at home between those who had family abroad and those who did not. The history, the history, culture, and economy of Chaozhou became increasingly entangled with those of Shanghai, Bangkok, Southern Malaya, West Borneo, and Hong Kong. I didn't put Singapore in here, but Singapore as well. That is to say, the period from 1767 to 1929 witnessed a great convergence of southeastern China with the lands of the Nanyang. Southeast coastal Chinese were not necessarily trapped in an ecological cul-de-sac, as Ken Pomerantz has famously asserted for the lower Yangtze region. Like the colonizing nations of Europe, they gained access to overseas land, resources, and investment and work opportunities after the 18th century. And the picture that emerges of of this region of China, at least, is not one of Chinese divergence from European modernity, but rather of a convergence in colonial or semi-colonial sites that were critical to modern development and accelerating levels of capital accumulation. Remittances from all classes of overseas Chinese were an important part of the story, as I'm sure many of you know. They sustained individual families and villages and contributed to class disparities at home, as I mentioned. They offset the trade deficits that plagued the region, and I would say indeed most of coastal China in the first half of the 20th century. Moreover, they derived from overseas commercial and industrial development investments, as well as from wage labor abroad. The return of these activities redounded to the benefit of the home region, constituting a phenomenal repatriation of wealth, or more precisely, a massive transfer of capital from colonial sites and Siam to the homeland. Now, some of the early reviews of this book have taken issue with the ways I have characterized the experiences of overseas Chinese as quasi-colonial, but I don't use that term, actually. So I'd like to take a few moments to discuss this, and perhaps we might continue the discussion in the Q&A. First of all, let me start by saying when Europeans began to notice or spy or encounter groups of Chaozhou Chinese living in Southeast Asia in the 18th and early 19th century, they often referred to those settlements as colonies. I mean, that was how they understood what the Chinese were up to, that they were engaged in the same kind of colonial project that they themselves were engaged in. From a 19th century European standpoint, Chaozhou's expansion into Southeast Asia was similar to that of Western powers in that it shared some of the characteristics Europeans traditionally identified with the colonial project. So, for example, commercial elites extracted raw materials abroad. They forged new markets overseas for the sale of goods and the investment of capital. They wrested control of indigenous territory and provided work opportunities for the home country's quote-unquote excess labor supply, as it was called in England in the 19th century. So J.A. Hobson, the prominent British critic of 19th century imperialism, described the arguments of European business people or business interests in favor of colonialism that prevailed in 1902 in precisely this way. These were the arguments that British interests were making. And although this economic interpretation of imperialism, that Europe economically needed colonies, has been critiqued by generations of historians in the Anglo-American Academy, its logic was compelling to those who were actively engaged in the colonial enterprise overseas and who understood Chinese migration to Southeast Asia in the same self-interested light. These Europeans also appreciated that colonialism in Southeast Asia prior to 1929, or certainly the 1920s, was utterly unsustainable without Chinese from all locations in China. But they also understood the extent to which their colonial effort redounded to the benefit of the Chinese. Chaozhou natives who returned home after sojourning abroad used to recount a joke that was common among Westerners in Southeast Asia, but especially in Singapore, in the early 20th century. And in Southeast Asia, the Europeans raise all the cattle, but the Chinese get all the milk. Now, the joke exaggerated the disadvantages of the Europeans, and it antagonized the Chinese, who actually did most of the hard work raising the cattle, so to speak. But it reflected Western anxieties about the ways Chinese profited from the colonial enterprise without bearing much of the onus of being imperialists. Now, obviously, the Europeans, the Americans, the Japanese, they held the preponderant military and governmental power, and a voracious Euro-American demand led to shifts in the exports of certain commodities in the 20th century. The intra-Asian trade, nonetheless, continued to be dominated by Chinese. Chaozhouis, for example, shut the British out of the profitable rice milling business of Bangkok, for example. British were constantly trying to get into that business, but it was also Chaozhouis who dominated that business at the time, and they just shut the British out. And also the rice markets of the ports of South China had as many distorting effects on the societies and economies of southeastern China as the policies promoted by Paris or London. My colleague at Northwestern, Hayden Cherry, has shown how the Chinese-dominated rice trade shaped the prospects of the impoverished floating population of French Indochina, for example. So what we see in Southeast Asia was a process of Western colonization that advanced Chinese interests almost as much as it did those of Europeans and Americans and later Japanese, mostly because the entire process unfolded across the long-standing translocal spheres of Chinese native place groups from Chaozhou and elsewhere in China. Colonialism across Southeast Asia was as much a transnational class project as it was an expansion of the European nation-state. So this raises the question, was the history of maritime Chaozhou a colonial history? Now, Republican-era Chinese scholars tended to depict overseas Chinese, including Chaozhou's natives, as having manifested the spirit of colonial conquest and entrepreneurial dynamism. Most famously, of course, the reformist-minded intellectual Liang Qichao referred to the founders of early modern overseas Chinese communities as colonialists, whose economic domination of local economies should be admired. It was also, to him, scientifically and historically obvious that Chinese and not Europeans should rule over the indigenous people of these lands. Xiumin Cai has depicted this sort of thinking among early 20th century Chinese intellectuals as, quote, a sinocentric form of colonialism in which Chinese expansion into the region was deemed natural and efficacious. And more recently, Shelley Chan has referred to, quote, a diaspora moment of Chinese national formation when scholars affiliated with Jinan University back in China sought to link Chinese national identity to Chinese immigrants. These specialists in Nanyang studies portrayed overseas Chinese as, quote, incomplete colonialists without China's protection and geopolitical incorporation, end of quote. So in this nationalistic understanding, true Chinese colonialism could only be achieved after the overseas settlements were absorbed by the modern Chinese state. Now, of course, these were political discourses, and they were kind of an anachronistic interpretation of the goals of an earlier generation of these sojourners in an age of heightened Chinese nationalism. Migrants who had ventured overseas to benefit their families and their villages were now depicted as having acted in the interests of the modern Chinese nation. But this thinking was very common in the early pre-war period, certainly pre-war 20th century China. It's very much in line with the thinking of Li Changfu, who wrote the most influential history of what he called Chinese colonialism in the first half of the 20th century. He distinguished Chinese colonialism from the European variety, which was predicated on power politics and economic exploitation. Instead, he asserted, the Chinese version was characterized by mass migration to Southeast Asia and was a natural product of the geographical expansion of the two maritime provinces of Fujian and Guangdong. In his view, the natural expansion of southeastern China over the centuries was thwarted only by the rise of Western colonialism in Southeast Asia, and not so much because of the expansionism of the nation state, of Europe itself per se, but because of the power afforded Westerners by the strong military backing of the modern nation state. This was the key variable for him and for other scholars. The overseas Chinese were on their own, and they were neither protected nor supported by Ming, Qing, nor Republican military and governmental power. Now, this, of course, for me is the point, and in turn underscores one major reason why the experiences of overseas Chinese merchants and laborers should not be construed as a conventional form of colonialism. The Ming and the Qing never permitted the colonial tail, so to speak, to wag the metropolitan dog. They were never dragged into colonial-style wars in an effort to make the South China Sea safe for Chinese merchant adventures. The Chinese state, in fact, had little to do with the success of non-tributary Chinese capitalist enterprise or mass migration overseas prior to the 20th century. So yes, the overseas Chinese were very much on their own, but the absence of Chinese state power, in fact, enabled these Chinese to engage in territorial acquisition, resource extraction, and commercial domination in a manner that was more enduring and perhaps even more successful than that of many Europeans prior to the 20th century. If the exploits of overseas Chinese constituted colonialism, it was a translocal type of colonialism forged informally by Chinese native place groups rather than politically and militarily by a conquering nation state. And the Chinese succeeded in this endeavor because their approach to overseas economic extraction was less expensive and more efficacious than that of the Euro-American variety. Euro-American traditions of economic expansion and power projection were heavily statist, relying on navies, armies, treaties, consulates, secret services, overseas courts, and so on, all sorts of other expensive institutions. The Chinese, in contrast, pursued their interest in Southeast Asia informally after the 17th century. The state was rarely involved in significant ways. So instead, the Chinese relied on such institutions as merchant-dominated huiguan, or native place associations, gongshi, brotherhoods, and business networks. And these just facilitated a cheaper and more effective approach to economic expansion and success. They were informal, adaptive, inexpensive, and they were controlled by people on the ground. But I just think that colonialism is too limited a term to apply to the variegated experiences of overseas Chinese. I think that Qiao Zhouyi's economic and demographic expansion into Southeast Asia and Shanghai reflected less a colonial dynamic than a territorial one. And by territoriality, I don't refer to the organizing principle of the modern European state or the Westphalian state, so to speak, in which state power is exerted over defined blocks of space. And territorial control is understood as an extension of the state's power. In fact, quite the opposite. I instead invoke the more primordial idea of the territory as the, quote, primary geographical expression of social power, as the geographer Robert David Sack has described it. In this understanding, quote, territoriality is an indispensable means to power at all levels, from the personal to the international. In humans, it is best understood as a spatial strategy to affect, influence, or to control resources. It is a form of spatial behavior, end of quote. So this conceptualization of territoriality dates back to the Neolithic, and territorial claims over time were made first by families and tribes, eventually states, in multifarious processes that anthropologists have called, quote, the unfolding of society over a territory. So territorialism encompasses the entire range of human geospatial behavior. So humans deploy a repertoire of strategies to maintain to maximize their access to and control over land. And the territorial strategies employed by Chaozhou natives across their maritime sphere reflected this diversity. I mean, sometimes they advanced their interests at home and abroad through violence, and you see some of that occasionally. But for the most part, Chaozhou sojourners simply migrated in enormous numbers to polities that were administered by others. Overseas, they lacked sovereign control over land, and yet they achieved near total domination of many of the resources and commodities produced in these territories. Indeed, the absence of formal sovereignty enhanced the Chaozhou Chinese advantage across a much wider translocal maritime world than political sovereignty would have made possible in any specific locale. So a rice king like Guoyan or Kwakdam became wealthy in the rice milling business of Saigon, even as he became a major property owner and real estate owner in Singapore. A family like the Liu made a fortune in the rubber business in Singapore, Johor, and Manila, the banking industry in Singapore, the rice trade connecting Shantou, Hong Kong, Saigon, and Bangkok, and the gum industry in Siam. And they and other Chaozhou elite families were among the biggest landowners in Singapore at the time. They also were among the biggest landowners back in Chaozhou. Their territorial strategy was to avoid political control of territory and instead control commodities and sectors of the labor market, which enabled them to dominate, along with other Chinese obviously, much of the commerce of the port cities of the South China Sea. Now, this process was not simply one of human migration. It involved economic extraction and the structural transformation of overseas economies, as we see in particular in the Chaozhou's case in Siam and in Cambodia, and later in the 20th century in Cambodia. So the Chinese achieved all of the, or many of the benefits of colonialism, access to territory and natural resources, and opportunities for work, investment, and the accumulation and repatriation of capital without the cost, bother, and infamy of territorial administration. They left that to states who served as their nominal overlords. So anyway, the book is about many other things aside from this, but that's just basically the larger arguments. So thank you for listening to me here one more time. That's it.
Thank you very much, Professor Macauley, for a very thought-provoking lecture. So we will now, I get that you will then address a number of questions from the audience as well. Before we get to that, we are also entertaining questions on Slido. So this is for the ones who, the audience that are coming in or viewing this particular talk on YouTube. But if you feel like you want to post your question on Slido, please feel free to do it. Scan in the QR code and then just basically type in your question, and I'll handle it with this iPad. As long as I still have it in my hands, I will do it. So if I may invite the audience, people here, who if you have a question, please raise your hand. And it will be particularly helpful to us to also maybe mention what your name is. And that will be very helpful for us as well. Okay, any questions from the audience? And we have a number of microphones, so we'll then bring it up to you. Oh, okay.
Thank you very much. It was so fantastic. My name is Pat Gilbert. I'm an art historian teaching here. I'm interested in what you say about the connection with Siam. So I'm wondering whether the large number of them came around Rama III reign, which is when we have a lot of trading with China, including lots of sculptures, you name it, the potteries that came. Can you address that? Because you were talking about trading with rice, like rice from Siam. I'd like to learn more.
Yeah, the Siamese case is really the most important, I think, for the Chaozhouese. I tend to focus on the Straits often because I was interested in the colonial question. It's, gosh, I don't even know where to begin. There's a Siamese historian named Nidi Aosawang who wrote this book. Yeah, you must know him. I had to have a colleague hold my hand and bring me to his work with a pen and sail that really makes this interesting observation about how, basically the Chinese inadvertently worked their way into the Sakdina system, which is this pre-existing aristocratic system. So they're participating in that. But as he and other people have noted, that they become the face of the monetary economy. And this whole process is shifting Siam from, a subsistence economy to this more globalized money economy. And of course, an objective observer stands back and says, that's a good thing. I mean, economically speaking, that was good for the Siamese, but it had all sorts of problems. The Chinese skilled labor came from China, and so skilled craftspeople in Siam didn't get to participate in this. And there was a lot of corvée labor, and so the more elite Chinese investors simply became more aristocratic. And the the Siamese aristocracy became more bourgeois, so to speak, to use his term. So that's an interesting transformation that I found absolutely fascinating. And he thinks that, either inadvertently or not, the Siamese elite kind of made the Chinese the obvious face of this monetary economy, so that they were the ones bearing the brunt of the disgruntlement when people are dragged into newer forms of economic exchange. Other than that, though, the rice trade there was phenomenal. And one other point, because I could guess on forever, it's one of my favorite topics. You have the creation of plantation economies, plantations in a place like Siam. And it's very different from the southeast coast, where even like large lineages didn't have that particularly big properties. And people were saying what you need to do was to kind of proletarianize rural labor and create these plantation economies, so you minimize labor inputs and maximize productivity. And that's also what was going on in Siam and other places, so that increasingly on these plantations, at least, the mill hands, say a sugar plantation, the mill hands and the owners were Chinese, but the tenants were Siamese. So this is how you see this kind of mutual transformation and entanglement in the two places. But yeah, the level of Chaozhou's migration to Siam was huge, and they're still the largest Chinese dialect group there. In fact, I talked to people from Siam or Thailand who often say, my background's Chaozhou, like, oh my God, what am I doing telling you your own history, sort of thing.
How about numbers of women? Did they come also?
Yeah, it increases only in the 20th century. And this kind of work for Siam I got off Bill Skinner, which, by the way, was a shocker. You work in late Imperial China, and Bill Skinner, we're all Skinnerians, right? You move into Southeast Asia, and the big work is Bill Skinner's. It's just like the guy was a phenomenal person. But anyway, I'm using most of his work for this, but for the specific case of Siam. But it's women did not migrate in large numbers except for sex laborers, so they're like, and they basically recreate family lives in these overseas communities. It's often gotten a lot of negative historical assessments, but it is familial. And I think Matthew Summers' work on marital strategies and basically selling the sex of one's wives as a common thing among the poor. You do see these in these overseas communities. In the 20th century, women begin to migrate more, and especially in Chaozhou, because after 1891, the political situation really becomes untenable. So more women leave, although it's still predominantly male. And then, so you have the formation of actual Chinese communities in these places, and that coincides, according to Skinner, with the rise of Chinese nationalism and the kind of the diminishment of this sort of competition among native place or dialect groups, and they become overseas Chinese become more nationalistic, especially after the Xinhai Gaming. They become much more identified with, say, the Nationalist Party at this period of time, and so the problem for them is becoming more. They're assimilating less, becoming more identified as Chinese. Chinese schools are being set up, so they're like learning the language. But at the same time, of course, the Thais are also becoming more nationalistic themselves. So that's another cause of problems among the two groups. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the question.
Another question? On the back.
Thank you very much for the introducing speech. And I am actually a very new student to Singapore. I just arrived here for 1 month, and I am actually from Chaozhou area. Yes, and well, although I cannot speak Teochew anymore because of the, how can I say, Mandarin education and how as the development of our country. So I just it's very intriguing that you have this speech about the extended immigration history of the Teochew to the Southeast Asia. And I just make me think of the few days ago, because it's the Singaporeans' Ghost Festival called Zhongyuanjie. In the community, I actually have a small talks with the old people who is Chaozhouese in this community. And I said, I'm from Chaozhou, and they said, oh, you're our own people, you have our own bloods. But when I say that I cannot speak Teochew anymore, and you say, oh, if you cannot speak that language, then you are not our people anymore. I feel kind of a little bit sad, but it's okay. So I suddenly feel like after this speech, I think that the concept of our own people, is it related to the social, cultural phenomenon of the extensive immigration history of the Teochew people in your research? Thank you very much.
I have to speak into the microphone, but no, thanks for that question. It actually reminds me of one of my favorite stories of just being abroad. I was at Shantou University, and I was waiting to meet somebody, and there were 2 signs along this wall, and one said no smoking, and the other said, please speak Putonghua, Goyu, whatever it was. And they're sitting under the sign, smoking and speaking Chaozhouese, so I thought that was just hilarious. You see that in Taiwan too. But yeah, it's really interesting. I was once at an AAS panel on Southeast Asia, but it was we were talking about the Philippines, and this woman who's Sino-Filipino, I guess, she said in the Philippines, people don't call themselves Chinese if they didn't go to Chinese language schools. That was the determining thing for them. It was studying the language and not just inheriting culture with grandma sort of thing, but like becoming Chinese through the school system. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's kind of getting at what you're saying. But she herself, although she was, overseas Chinese, never really thought of herself as that. Her brother did go to these schools, so the parents did send him to these schools, and he identified more as Chinese. Whether or not that's an anecdote, I don't know. What impresses me about the period of time I'm studying is the scale of the migration. At one point, when you wonder why is there so much animosity between Hokkien-ese or Fujianese and Chaozhouese in the 19th century, you just see this massive amount of Chaozhouese migration and kind of a normal but less massive from Fujian. And so numerically in the 19th century, the Chaozhouese were, the numbers themselves were diminishing Hokkien-ese. That gets reversed toward the end of the century. But that solidarity was maintained through religion, as you're saying, because the institutions, disputes among business groups were made in were resolved in temples, for example, right? They're temples and business institutions and philanthropic societies and job placement. That's all predicated on knowing the language. And then you end up working on someone else. So I think in this period I'm talking about, this native place identification was much stronger. You still sense it here, because I come here, or students come to Northwestern from Singapore, and then they say I'm Chaozhouese, and I think, oh my gosh, here I am telling you, your own history sort of thing. But the identification with being Chinese is much stronger, I think. But if you have and I have a lot of students who have grandparents. One's Cantonese, the other's Chaozhouese, or one's.
Me too. This is my case.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And that's why I can only speak Mandarin and Cantonese, but not Chaozhouese anymore.
Yeah, and I think in the 19th century, if we were sitting in an auditorium like this, although I don't know if they had auditoriums this fancy, but that would be very difficult. I mean, but that guoyu, that impulse to make Mandarin the language, was a way of diminishing those geographical and cultural divisions among the Chinese. Your question is extremely rich, but I'll leave it at that. But it's good luck as studying in Singapore. I'm envious.
Thank you very much. Because that everyone from the Chaozhouese community and everyone there really stressed that the concept of own people. So that's why my grandpa also telling me continuously that you need to learn this language. You need to be you need to be involved in this community, and that's why sometimes I feel really regretful for that.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. There's a very famous Chaozhouese banker in Cambodia, Phnom Penh, and their family really suffered immeasurably during the Khmer Rouge years. But they're back, and he's running this big bank, and he insists that all the Chinese speak Chaozhouese. So this hasn't disappeared. It's not as strong as it was in the period that I'm studying, but it still strongly exists, as your experiences attest to. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Tom.
Yeah, thank you so much, Melissa, for the fascinating talk. My name is Jo Tom-Wah. I'm associate professor at a history program here. So I have two questions. One is, you mentioned you're going to talk about some pushbacks against. Yeah, particularly we talk about I was on a decolonizing Chinese history panel at AAS, and there were severe pushbacks, right? Like whether we should characterize Chinese migration also as settler colonialism, and in conjunction with the current discussion about Chinese colonialism in Xinjiang, in Hong Kong. And the second question, I guess, you mentioned colonial state building is something that is onerous, right? So without the burden of institution building, it gives the Chaozhouese more flexibility. They're more agile. But I wonder whether there are also kind of upsides of institution building after Chaozhou or Shantou didn't become like a vibrant colonial metropole like London, right, or Amsterdam.
Okay, yeah, I don't even know where to begin. I think Elizabeth Shin's given me the toughest pushback. I just didn't identify anybody because I wanted to stay within my time frame too. But it's funny because she kind of stopped at the idea of colonialism. And I'm, as I said, I don't like to use that term in relation to these people because I think there's something else going on. It's superficially similar. It's economic extraction. It's structural transformation. It's territorial, I don't want to say domination, but mastery in some ways. But this is why I'm coming up with this term. It may not be the best term, and someone can come up with a better one, I think. But I don't want to sound like all those people in the Bush administration who said, who ignored the warnings about looming 9/11 because terrorists needed the state. But I actually do think colonialism needs the state. Even that kind of informal colonialism that you see in Treaty Port China, that whole system is predicated on the European state. Those wars were fought by the British Navy. The treaties were signed by British government officials. the whole system endured for a lot of reasons, not least of which it endured under the shadow of the gunboat. So even informal colonialism requires the state. And I think what the Chinese were doing in Southeast Asia, it didn't have the state. And that's what I think is really, truly different. It's not state-driven. And it's not colonialism in that sense. In some ways, it's people moving and finding a new life for themselves. But where I pull back from just that is this question of kind of dominating certain economic sectors, as well as, being central players in the economic or structural transformation of the society. And so that is more than just migration, and so, this old anthropological or geographical term, really, of territorialism, I think, is less pejorative, but also I'm trying to get at this point that it's not just migration, it's more than a demographic process. I think she just kind of stopped at the colonial issue. And I think it's kind of harder if you're Chinese in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong, in fact, was a colony, and the Chinese were colonized by the British in Hong Kong. I mean, it's true, not that many Chinese lived in Hong Kong at the time of the beginning of the colony, but I could see why she's taking umbrage at it, but I don't think she fully appreciated what I was trying to do as far as the, finding a different word to, appreciate that it's not conventional Euro-American colonialism. What was the second question, though, again?
Sorry, you mentioned like without, kind of Chinese territorialism was without the backing of the state, and that make them like more flexible, more agile, right? Informal. But I wonder whether there are also downsides of like.
Yeah. No, there are lots of downsides to it, too. Although, let the record show that there are still Chinese Huiguan in Southeast Asia. There's no colonial state left in Southeast Asia. A lot of reasons for that, but when you want to overthrow the colonial order, you overthrow the governmental master. You don't necessarily overthrow the powerful economic forces that were also there as a result of colonial encouragement, sort of thing. But with the absence of the state has downsides, and I think that's what you really see when you begin to see the rippling effects of the Great Depression. Because when you look at the emigration and immigration statistics, suddenly it just gets reversed. For the first time since the records were kept, more Chinese returned to Chaozhou than set out for their great adventures, and that meant that, we often think that the Depression didn't have that big of an impact on China until 1934 on the Silver Purchase Act, things like that. But in fact, it was devastating for the Southeast Coast because these colonial powers just started sending laborers home. They weren't, Singaporean, they hadn't been born then, they might have arrived maybe 5 years earlier, but they were sent home, and then the whole Chaozhou area was flooded with unemployed laborers, which has exacerbated the economic downturn in those areas. So that's an example, and I could give you others, but that's a big example of where not having political control of the territory has a real downside, because they couldn't control that. Maybe they would have returned home anyway, but in fact, the colonial government sent them packing. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that really fabulous talk. I'm still grappling with what you said. I guess my question, I'm coming at this from the perspective of South Asia, and as conventional a case of colonialism as it gets, right? And where you think of sort of, maybe there's Chaozhouis as kind of the collaborators in some sort, right? Like in a colonial context. But that's not a terminology that you would use, right? Like you were saying, they're more than collaborators, they're more than just, there's like a transnational class-based alliance sort of that you're also, which is also the case with collaborators, but there's something more to that class-based alliance. I'd love to know more about the class implications of the Chaozhouis with, European imperialism, and And yeah, like what implications does that have then for Pomeranz's great divergence, right? Because you said that this is obviously a different case, and I think you made a really compelling case for that. So where does it then, how do we understand the great divergence differently from this perspective?
Yeah, great, thank you for that. And it's interesting. I mean, so many of our ideas about colonialism come from the study of South Asia, because the scholarship is so rich. I don't use the word collaborators for the simple reason the Chinese were there before the British arrived. They were there long before. They were doing their thing, and it made their lives easier in the sense that, I think the rise of the court systems, for example, the British Navy's taking care of pirates. That's no longer something they have to worry about too much. All those, labor inputs that the colonial government has to do to fix up the harbor. I mean, a lot of the revenues were coming from Chinese economic activities, but so I don't see them as collaborators in that way. There's certain Chinese, as you get more into the 19th century, who are very Anglophilic. They would go to, I was talking about this with someone the other day, but like Raffles Institution, which was where you'd pick up a proper accent or something, and sort of dressing more and being more oriented toward the English. And the Liu family are interesting because half the families born in Singapore, half the boys, I mean, they just trace the boys, the men, half of them are born in Singapore and the other are born back in Chaozhou. And so the ones in Chaozhou have very strong identification with Chinese and with Chaozhou culture, and they really spent a lot of money developing a school system that's educating people in Chaozhouese and not in Mandarin, which is this 20th century. That's exact opposite of what you see in a lot of Chinese governments, what they were trying to accomplish. But and so there was a real pushback, I think, from the Chaozhouese who would meet up with their fathers in places like Singapore when they were old enough to learn the business and to learn English, and they were a lot less Anglophilic than their fathers, for example. There's a real dynamic there. The British, I mean, it's amazing. You find so much historical evidence of the British being completely aware that this colony in the Strait settlement was impossible without the Chinese. It would never have succeeded. Is that collaboration? There was only one Chinese on the legislative legislative council in the 19th century, Mr. Whampoa. That wasn't his name, but that was where he's from. It was really odd to spend a lot of time looking at British colonial sources. I have to admit, his name was Mr. Whampoa, but he was the only one until later on in the 19th century. The Chinese were here to do what their ancestors had been doing: is make money, control these ports, engage in trade, and they were absolutely vital to the success, certainly of this colony. But I don't see it as collaboration per se. But it is a point I'm making that colonialism in Southeast Asia is different, and it's different because of the Chinese. The Chinese, I might be wrong here. Maybe other people have studied other colonialisms, but I can't think of another colonial larger region where there are people like the Chinese who actually competed with the colonial power for economic domination. So I'm not sure I answered all of your question, but I just ate at the edges of it.
Okay. Maybe before the next question, it will be a good time to slot in another one that's on Slido.
Okay, great.
So I do not know who this is because it's anonymous.
Oh.
So anyway, I'm just going to read off it. Say, hello, thank you for your lecture. May I ask why you prefer to avoid the term quasi-colonial within this context? I think you have mentioned it earlier in the lecture. Are there particular connotations to the word to be avoided?
Yeah. Well, I've kind of addressed this a little bit. I think it's a distraction because I don't think it gets at the dynamic of what's happening in this Southeast Asian region with regard to the Chinese. It is similar, and I spent a lot of time working on that similarity. And economic extraction, that's one of those Marxian terms you throw out when you're talking about the material relevance of colonialism. But again, I go back to my colleague Hayden Cherry's work on Saigon and the poor of Saigon. For much of the 19th century, something like 80% of the exports went to China. So that you could see that if you're talking about colonial extraction, but it's basically just buying rice from people and sending it to China that was rice deficient. Southeast coast was rice deficient by this point. So there are lots of things you can point to that seem colonial, but I think that colonialism requires a state because there's a coercive element to it that forces people to act a certain way. And occasionally you see that, you always see that with the British, you see that with the French try at least, you certainly see it with the Americans in the Philippines. Don't even get me started on Japan, Japanese in Southeast Asia. But there's very little coercion. In many cases, especially in the 18th century, you have local rulers inviting the Chinese. In Borneo, the Sultan, he had certain stereotypical ideas about the Chinese. They work harder than the local people. But in fact, these mostly Hakkas who worked the mines of West Borneo, they were the best miners in China. And, of course, Chinese enterprise was better capitalized. They had better technologies. They had a trained labor force. So, these sultans of, I forget the name of it, but it's various regions of West Borneo are inviting them. And their understanding is that they will control agricultural production and sell it to the miners. And so everyone's going to make money and do fine. But as it turned out, in this case, the miners were Hakka and most of the agriculturalists were Chaozhouis. And so there's a real loss of control there. But they were invited there, and that's true you look in Johor, in the Gambier plantations, and you have, I forget, the name his surname was Chun, I'm getting his name right off the top of my head, who was invited to serve as a kind of police force in Johor to maintain the peace. And in Johor, from what I've read, this is speaking of the Leonards, or not Leonards, the Yandayas, my understanding is that Johor was unique in that leadership still maintaining control of the local economy, but it was just a kind of different dynamic from the colonial one. And as I said, it existed before, and in many ways it exists afterwards. Chinese resident in Singapore, the government seems, of course, this always seems to be run by the Lee Kuan Yew family, but it's the language is English. It's not Chinese, even though 76% of this land polity is Chinese. So it kind of endures, and it's almost like in Taiwan when the current president Tsai Ing-wen was asked about independence, and she says, "We don't have to declare independence. We already are." There's like a reality that is non-coercive. It's very economic, though. Anyway, I'm kind of blathering on, but I just think characterizing this colonialism is a distraction from the real historical experience of Chinese movement into these regions.
Thank you. Maybe 1 to 2 more questions before. Yeah. Oh, else. I introduce else, but you can.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. I'm Else from History. So Chrisman has this famous article on the segmentary structures of Chinese communities, right, where he talks about how dialect intersects with surname and locality. So I was wondering how this plays out in your work. So you start from the dialect group, but how, for example, do you end up with the Liu family in that specific place? Thank you.
Well, it's funny because his Liu Xizhi's biographies depict him as someone who was quite poor and then like dramatic success story. And although I I think he probably was not wealthy at all when he went to Singapore. They're already a Liu family there. And my suspicion, although I didn't find any source material to this, and it's probably out there somewhere, was that this family was alerting them to the idea that gutta percha is now, maybe the British want it desperately. You know, they're back in their own home village. You know how to manage a boat? Come over here. There's a big opportunity for an energetic young man. So, I mean, in some ways, someone told him to come and get on a boat, and he's not working at Gambier Plantation or working in a mine. He's buying gutta percha. So that's an interesting dynamic. I mean, almost all the people that I could see in the Chaozhou realm, at least, who were super successful, had that commercial link in some ways. Often it's through their mother's family, though, which was kind of interesting. And you'd see occasionally the males swearing brotherhood and, you know, doing the blood thing and everything with the mother's family. And they don't do that with their own families, because that's already a blood relationship, I guess, you know, but to forge that relationship. But that is one key to their success. Someone in the family got them into the business somewhere. And they suffered, of course. They live in the go-downs, these warehouses and everything. But it's not like working on a Gambier plantation or sugar plantation, you know, near the equator or anything. So there is an intersection of village, lineage, and this dialect group. It's not just the dialect group. It works out, though, because you can almost see sending your young son off to, you know, that process got normalized in a lot of ways that I haven't addressed here and I won't guess on. But it was not that common for average people to send your children out. That was just only gradual over the course of the 19th century. It must have been a comfort to know that you could go down the road and scream at someone's grandmother if your son didn't come home or couldn't come home. You know that you didn't have to go through an interpreter or anything. So I think the dialect group is so. I mean, you can't extrapolate this from other forms of connection or guangxi. But I was really shocked when I learned that Lo Ajit or Liu Shizhi was related to Liu Jianfa, because they transliterated the names differently. And, you know, it's easier to start this kind of work just looking at, you know, secondary sources on whatever. And I'm reading someone's work on Liu Jianfa as the creditor to James Brooks and Sarawak. And isn't that amazing? And it was only when I started to dig deeper into Chinese sources that I saw that they had that they were the same family. I mean, I don't know the exact connection, but they came from the same village. And that someone probably told Liu Jianfa, who was all similarly depicted as heading off as a very poor man off to the wild blue yonder, and then succeeding spectacularly beyond your imagination. It's definitely family telling them, this is the opportunity, and specifically, this is the kind of employment you want to engage in. Oh, and here's a little bit of money to get started. And just one more thing on this. It kind of moves away from your question, but it's an answer I wanted to give. No, it moves a little bit away from your question, but when you look at the oral history sources at the National Archives here, which I think are phenomenal source for this kind of diasporic studying of people in both locations, you see a real tension back home between branches of the same lineage who had commercial contacts and therefore financially more comfortable, and the branches that remained almost entirely farming or peasant, as I think was told, farmers. Because as you see in some of these interviews, these people come home with a little bit extra money and they buy land. And of course, in this region, buying land is usually through DN or mortgages. And you're not allowed to sell land outside of your lineage if you can avoid it. Usually most clan rules showed that. So the tension, you can imagine, when people coming back and buying their land, and they're all from these commercial families, this is also creating the kind of tension between urban and rural people at the dawn of the Revolutionary Age, even within the same families or lineages.
Okay. There are actually a couple more questions on Slido. I've just put it up so you can actually refer to it. Yeah, so the first, I think, it is to ask why you focus on the Chaozhouis, for instance, where they can be applied to other dialect groups, for instance. And the second question is to get more details in a sense to ask Professor Macauley to expand a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Let me start. These are great questions. Like, why the Chaozhou? You know, it's funny, in my first book, I ended up doing a case study of the Southeast Coast because for some reason I just found so many legal scandals related to these pettifoggers, litigation masters. And as I started reading just the regular secondary sources in English and Chinese on the region, I thought, wow, this place is really international. I knew that on one level, but I learned more about it. So for my next book project, I thought, well, that's a natural thing. I'll do, the transnational, what I thought then was using a transnational analysis, and that would be perfect. But the thing is, it gets down to this dialect group. You have to make a choice, and one thing that kind of really sealed the deal for me was an article that, I'm not sure I know how to pronounce the transliteration of his name, but En Jing Kyong. He taught at National University of Singapore for many years. And he was writing that in the 18th century, the rise of the Teochew, or, Deojo, the Chaozhou people, was historically unique. I mean, the Fujianis had been there forever. You have the Amoy Network, another terrific work by him, actually. The Cantonese, have been studied, although, someone should do this kind of work for the Cantonese too. And so I had to make a choice. And so I thought, well, a lot of people have been working on Fujian, if that's the case, if that's the modern story among these dialect groups, then I might as well tell that story because it's something that's kind of distinct from the early modern period. It's changed over time, and that seemed like a real challenge. So it was kind of serendipitous in some ways, but it stemmed from my first research effort. Let's see that. Coastal areas. Yes, I love it. I was talking about a little bit about this on Tuesday because I'm working at the relationship of people with water and people at the edge of oceans. But in fact, most people don't, until modern times, people didn't live on the ocean. They lived inland on the rivers because you're less likely to be, victimized by typhoons or you're less victimized by typhoons inland. And if you look at settlement across the globe, particularly in a colonial context, that is true. You see it in Latin America as well. People setting up settlements in the rivers, inland, where you can grow crops while you're simultaneously extracting resources. People like Carl Trocchi have kind of studied this. I mean, I really, leaned heavily on that man's work. He's a great scholar and had great publications on it. But you see this in a lot of contexts. And moving forward, as I work on a people's history of the South China Sea, I'm really hoping to look at delta regions, but these riverine regions, because it's such a settlement pattern along rivers, and the rivers enable you to gain access to the hinterland. You have to have a river system because you can do all the mining you want, but you can't lug tin on your. Well, they probably did at some point, but you need the river system. So in some cases you follow the money. In this case, you follow the river, basically, or follow the waterway. I think one weakness of the book, I think I picked up on it toward the end, is that I was very focused on the Chaozhouis, so the indigenous people appear in key moments, but I could have spent more time dealing with that, especially in Johor, where you have a large Chaozhouis presence, but a real cooperative kind of relationship with the Temenggong's, is that the name? The Temenggong's government. but you know, then you just one other thing about this the indigenous people and the conducting business with the local people, and there's a lot of great scholarship on West Borneo. But you see, there's the local people, the Dayaks, and they're just shoved to the side. So you have the Sultan bringing the Chinese in. The Dayaks are quite dissatisfied. I mean, some of them marry Chinese and everything, so it's complicated. But they are economically shoved to the side. And the business is with the rulers, basically, in general. The rulers and their people with connections to the rulers. That's the short answer to that question.
I think unfortunately we have to come to the, yeah, I mean, obviously there are a lot of questions and people are very excited about your talk, and thank you for entertaining all the questions and addressing all of them. So would like to invite everyone to join me in thanking Professor Melissa Macauley, and so thank you very much for
Thanks
that.
so much.
And allow me to show, so we would also like you to, if you could, also, like, follow, and join us. And so this is, this will allow us, in some sense, to have more talks in the future and invite different persons and visiting professors and all that. So thank you very much, everyone, and for being such enthusiastic and very engaging crowd. And so thank you, and have a wonderful Thursday. Yeah, see you hopefully at next time we have a next series of talks. Or the next talk in the same series.
Yeah. Is that Steve Miles? Did you fly in from Hong Kong?